So, North Korean troops are working with Russia in the Kremlin's broader war plans against Ukraine. That alone was enough to spawn some intriguing headlines. However, I have yet to see a proper discussion that connects the dots of what is actually happening here politically. And the political maneuvering, to me, is even more interesting than the sheer novelty of North Korea participating in a land war in Europe. What we are observing here is a clever transfer of domestic risk from a place where it is relatively high to a place where it is relatively low. And once we understand that, we can make better sense of what this says regarding potential trouble in Moscow, the complications that the Kremlin faces by adding a foreign military to its efforts, how to interpret the political risks in Pyongyang, whether North Korean soldiers will comply as intended once on the ground, the more general problems with integrating forces, and how Ukraine should go about responding to all of this. However, I want to start off with a basic point about interventions. Specifically, that what is happening here is rather weird in terms of timing. Now, I do not know whether we are currently at the end of the war, the middle of the war, the middle end of the war, or the middle beginning of the war. But this is not the beginning of the war. That phase ended more than 2 years ago. I note this because, statistically speaking, most third parties join wars at the beginning of the battle. Yes, the United States' forays into World War I and World War II came late, but those cases are as famous as they are misleading. The reason is that third parties primarily want to join, because the sum of their two militaries working together may be greater than their individual strengths, each added together in isolation. So if your partner insists on taking part in a war, then you might want to help out immediately, rather than waiting around for your partner's forces to be attrited. Consequently, when we are thinking about the Russian-North Korean partnership, we should not be framing it as though they both like each other, and so one friend is helping out another, though that is part of the story. But if that were fully the case, North Korea would have raced to help Russia in 2022. Instead, we need to ask ourselves what has happened recently that explains this specific timing. For the answer, or at least an answer, we turn to the Kursk offensive and Russia's federal finances. Specifically, we head here. Back in August, Ukraine initiated a surprise attack on Russian soil and quickly captured a decent chunk of the Kursk Oblast. At one point, it looked pretty bad for Russia. Ukraine had occupied territory about this far into its rival. Now, a river winds down this way, and Ukraine saw that there were a few nice bridges running across it, and bombed them all. That left a pocket of Russian troops de facto surrounded, remembering that Kyiv also had troops deployed along the international border, and therefore risked Ukraine capturing an even greater chunk of that Russian territory. However, with its back against a river wall in its own country, Russia avoided that worst-case scenario by launching an attack from the north that followed the river, with its trapped soldiers adding further pressure from the west. This opened a corridor of resupply, and Russia has used it to further press Ukraine eastward. So, the good news for Moscow is that the earlier concern about Ukraine running roughshod in the area is no longer on anyone's minds. Kyiv made a major play, but it is not about to spell the end of the Kremlin. The bad news for Moscow is that Ukrainian troops still occupy a fair bit of land. Worse, if you look at the calendar, the weather is turning. With rain and mud comes a slowdown in offensive operations along every theater, Kursk included. Yes, things will get easier once snow starts to fall and as the ground begins to freeze, but it will still not be easy. That, in turn, will give Ukraine more time to construct entrenchments, meaning that Russia will have a harder time resolving the problem later. Moreover, the better defended an area is, the greater the ratio of attacking troops need to be to negate the positional advantage. And that finally connects us back to North Korea. The dilemma that the Kremlin faced was that repositioning troops from the eastern Ukrainian front would reduce offensive capacity in the latter location, where Russia has been making substantial gains. However, the alternative was to use conscripts to fight off the Kursk invasion. Now, in theory, that is the exact purpose of having those conscripts. It is quite literally their job to defend Russia from invasions. But the Kremlin worried that their participation could cause instability in Moscow. You see, they were not there voluntarily, they were far less experienced than the Ukrainian soldiers involved, and their families were far more likely to raise issues regarding their participation. Combine those factors together with the upheaval following the September 2022 mobilization, and it was enough to deter the Kremlin from trying that again. A hidden third option, at least for the long run, was to simply recruit more contract soldiers by raising the compensation packages. The finances of that looked horrible, though. The already high contract offers were driving up wages in the private sector, as employers have to compete with the Ministry of Defense to keep employees from wanting to deploy abroad. Meanwhile, MOD contracts are keeping the tank and artillery factories running 24/7 at the expense of consumer product output. Combine that together with some migration out of the country, and all of that has led to soaring inflation. At the end of October, the Russian central bank had to raise interest rates to an astounding 21% to try to keep it in check. If only there were some other place to go. Now, North Korea has been involved in the war for quite a while at this point. Western sanctions have constrained North Korea for so long that its industries exist outside of the global supply chains. In contrast, that was not true for Russia. As such, when sanctions came down in 2022, the Russian defense industry struggled to keep the assembly lines moving. Meanwhile, North Korea could just keep going, so Pyongyang takes in the rubles and out go the bombs. Along with that, North Koreans have already been in Ukraine, not as active participants, but rather as observers. If you are using North Korean equipment, then you want North Koreans there to provide direct feedback to the manufacturers back at home. Western countries have been doing this in Ukraine from the start, too. It is nothing worth reporting. But what we are seeing now is different. This appears to be North Korean soldiers taking part in standard combat operations, apparently limited to Kursk for now, but who knows what the future holds. As for why, let's think about this in terms of political risk for a second. Every native soldier that Russia brings into the fold raises the chances that the Kremlin will face various domestic challenges, be they from the inside or from angry mobs on Red Square. Furthermore, these risks do not increase linearly. It gets exponentially worse as you plunge deeper into the coffers. Meanwhile, Kim Jong-un faces the same sort of political instability problem with any type of troop deployment. However, when specifically deploying on behalf of Russia, his losses are worse across the board because it is not North Korea's fight. At least the Kremlin can tell Russian citizens that they are in a war to restore Russia's historical boundaries, and make that argument plausible, if not outright effective. In contrast, for all the government control over media in North Korea, the best pitch that Kim Jong-un can make is that they are helping an alliance partner in need. Putting all of this together, it is efficient for Russia to recruit for itself at the start. But if your military needs eventually push you way out to here, then it makes sense to dip a bit into the North Korean well. To draw a simple analogy, it is as if Russia was driving the war for a long time, but started to get highway hypnosis. So they did the logical thing and paid to shift North Korea to the driver's seat. Speaking of payment, no doubt that North Korea is not doing this for free. What exactly Kim is receiving in return is unclear, though, whether it be money, assistance with North Korea's rocket program, or otherwise. Certainly, the public relations between the two are hitting a new high. Now, it is not as if Russia has historically ignored North Korea. These are some photos from a July 2000 visit. Actually, to give you a sense of how crazy this time was, these photos are from Putin's trip on the very next day to a G8 summit. Before Russia got kicked out. It also seems crazy that Putin's tenure overlapped with Clinton's, until you realize that Clinton is younger than both Trump and Biden. Anyway, the point is that if the North Korean government has political risk capacity to spare, then it makes sense for the Kremlin to pay the price and improve the welfare between the two. I will cover some of the nuance behind those curves in a second, but it is first worth examining what this tells us about Russian weakness. The editorials almost write themselves here. Russia is so desperate that now it is relying on North Koreans to fight its war. And sure, that point stands. But it also tells us that North Korea is apparently stable enough to support this, and that Russia and North Korea have resolved any frictions that may have otherwise prevented a deal from getting done. And we all know by now that the existence of efficiency-enhancing agreements does not guarantee that we obtain such outcomes. So yes, it is bad news for Russia that Russia needs North Koreans to handle the situation. But it is good news for Russia that there is a supply of North Koreans to take on those roles, and that there is an agreement in place to do this. And from an observer's perspective in the West, it is not obvious which effect is the dominant one. Okay, back to those curves for a second. The relevant calculations here are more complicated than what I have illustrated thus far. For one, there are direct benefits to North Korea for its soldiers to get involved, at least in small numbers. The Russia-Ukraine war is giving us a portrait of what modern warfare looks like. In contrast, North Korea has skipped at least a full generation of battle strategy. The last time that North Korean soldiers were involved in major military operations was during the Korean War. The corresponding armistice was signed in 1953. Thus, barely anyone is still alive with combat experience. In turn, no one has direct knowledge of computerized warfare, never mind the drone-based combat that we find ourselves in today. So, if you are Kim Jong-un and want to take a look at the lines on maps, and shift them favorably vis-a-vis South Korea, it may help to ship some troops far west and get some first-hand experience. The problem with that thinking is that North Korea does not make this choice in isolation. South Korea does not want those lines to shift, and thus now has a direct reason to get involved in the war. So far, Seoul has played a tertiary role when it comes to the fight. Quietly, South Korea has become the 10th largest arms exporter in the world, but due to legal quirks, has not given arms to Ukraine because a war is currently ongoing. Instead, the West has engaged in a dance that only a lawyer could appreciate. South Korea begins by selling to a Western country, and then the Western country takes like items sitting on its shelves and sends them to Ukraine. See, these were America's, and these were South Korea's. They were totally different. Okay, it is kind of silly, but you know what? It works. Political theater at its finest, even if Russia was probably not so amused. In any case, now North Korea is involved, so exerting political capital to break down those legal barriers becomes easier. At a minimum, South Korea will send interrogators to Ukraine to assist with that aspect of the situation, because as soon as troops make it into battle, some are inevitably going to surrender. As a result, South Korea may have access to the largest pool of relatively average North Koreans in memory. That represents a treasure trove of intelligence for South Korea, and an important reason why the Russia-North Korea deal did not arise sooner. And that provides a smooth transition to some details on what exactly the political risks are to Pyongyang. Or, as the classic saying goes, what goes up must come down. The North Korean troops do not appear to be volunteers either. But that said, within North Korea's hierarchy, soldiers rank fairly highly. Starving soldiers are ineffective soldiers. so at least they reliably get 3 square meals a day. That, of course, buys loyalty to the regime. But if the average North Korean soldier begins to worry that he may find himself in a Ukrainian meat grinder, well, that is a recipe for disaster. Of all possible challengers to a regime, the military may be the scariest. Visually, that would suggest that the cost line rapidly curves upward, meaning that there is more to this well of soldiers, but not at the availability that the Kremlin might wish it to be. Side note, a somewhat easier problem to solve here is Russia's labor shortage. You see, North Korea has a bunch of people simply standing around, not doing anything particularly productive on the peninsula. Thus, there is another opportunity for North Korea to assist Russia in an area of need. Do not be surprised if that is the next thing that we hear about. There is another problem that will arise once they arrive, though. You actually need them to do their jobs. We have previously discussed how this is a significant problem for Russian soldiers, even though they are relatively more interested in the war. So that is going to go double when Kim Jong-un orders his own soldiers to participate. One might further imagine what will happen once any of them get taken as prisoners of war. Their South Korean monitors will undoubtedly have a fun time showing them what life is like outside of the Hermit Kingdom. Now, it might be easy for the prisoners to discount what they hear as political propaganda, but then they will start eating their meals, which, if South Korea is doing its job properly, will be better than what 99% of North Koreans can afford. Even those just spending time in Russia, a comparatively rich country, might start getting ideas. That, in turn, will complicate work programs as well. You see, as a general point, it will not take much given that North Korea looks like this from space. That right there is Pyongyang, and for comparison, this is South Korea. As a result, there may be an incentive to keep North Korean soldiers out of active combat roles, and otherwise tucked away from society. This reduces the likelihood of capture and also facilitates their handlers to keep an eye on them, a central solution to the aforementioned compliance problem. Then there are also more basic problems with integrating military forces. Part of the reason that North Korean soldiers are participating in the thousands is that a handful does not do much good. You cannot put a few North Koreans in units with Russians. The language barrier there will be a mess. So instead, you have North Korean units serving separately, but in conjunction with Russian units. But even getting that level of coordination to work properly will be a mess. Just ask NATO. They have been at it for about 3/4 of a century now, and still see their fair share of struggles. Reports indicate that every 30 North Korean soldiers are matched with only 3 Russian soldiers, and just 1 interpreter. That is a lot of work for that one guy. Best of luck to him when he tries to diffuse tensions when allegations inevitably fly that one of those factions is getting better gear than the other. Finally, there is the question of what Ukraine should do about any of this. Turning to the West for direct assistance is not the answer. Even as the prevailing discussion notes how there is an apparent double standard in that North Korea can intervene without consequences, but Western countries cannot. The reason that the United States and others are reluctant is because of how Russia might respond. North Korean troops do not directly reduce Russia's ability to respond. If anything, they lighten the Russian workload. And so here we are. At least the Pentagon is not adding any new restrictions to US weapons, meaning that Ukrainian troops are free to strike North Koreans just as they would any Russians. And all that together raises an interesting dilemma for Kyiv: to target them or to not target them. Obviously, if the North Korean troops were to go on an offensive, then Ukrainian troops would not have a real choice in the matter. However, if they are hanging out in logistical roles, with Russia remaining in the lead, then there is a trade-off. If you cause a bunch of casualties, then you force the issue in Pyongyang, and the potential for higher political risk means either a North Korean withdrawal or reluctance to participate any further. On the other hand, you risk a tripwire effect. The casualties could enrage North Koreans, creating a rally round the flag effect and an injection of yet more troops. I am sure Putin would toast to that. But you can see how it puts Kyiv in a minor quandary, and is not something that Western leaders would be toasting to. As a default expectation, absent new considerations, we should not anticipate that this is the end of North Korea's contributions. Remember, the trade occurs because Russia's marginal increase in risk here is higher than North Korea's marginal increase in risk here. Yep, I waited 20 minutes before talking about why the second derivative matters. Anyway, when more casualties inevitably arise and new troops replace them, Russia progresses further along its risk curve, which means it makes sense to dip a bit further into North Korea's curve. Certainly, South Korean intelligence is going to be working overtime to try to pin down the locations of North Korean troops and lobby Kyiv to order a strike. But whether that is a good idea in light of the deterrence tripwire trade-off is a separate intelligence question that is above my pay grade. Meanwhile, what is not above my pay grade is writing books about wars. That is basically what professors of international relations do for a living. Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.